Things like this were only seen in movies before now, but it happened on Thursday at Afromedia Street in the Okokomoaiko area of Lagos. The story behind the bird that changed in this woman is strange. From what I hear, three birds were flying in the area and suddenly one fell and landed into a water, and to the surprise of all around, the bird changed into this woman. A source told Tun the bird-turned-woman was arrested by the police where she confessed to be a native of Ikole, a town in Ekiti State. I wonder how the police is going to handle this case. Strange indeed.
Friday morning, around 9 a.m., the woman pictured above, who allegedly confessed to being a witch, was rescued from a gutter she was trapped in around Abalti Barracks, Ojuligaba in Surulere, Lagos. According to reports, a passerby had noticed someone stretching out her hand from a very small hole in a 6 feet deep gutter just in front of the army barracks and calling out for help. The passerby quickly ran into the army barracks to get help. Within minutes, a crowd gathered with people saying all sort of things about the lady inside the gutter and how she got trapped in it. Some said she's a witch, that she went for her meeting transformed as a bird, only to end up in the covered gutter after she fell uncontrollably as a bird from the sky, that it was inside the drainage she now transformed back into her human form. Some others said she was on her way from Oshogbo and got sucked in the gutter, and so on. When the woman was asked questions like "What are you doing inside the gutter?" she replied, weeping, "Please, I need water, help me." A senior officer of the Nigerian army reportedly asked the soldiers to get her out. A welder around the environment was called in and she was finally brought out by a good Samaritan who entered the gutter to help her out. She was brought out naked, covered up, and then she said, "My name is Amud Achimo. It was God that sent me here. He, God, said I should confess my sins so that I don't die. Please, I need water to drink. Help me. I don't know how I found myself here. Please help me." A Lagos state ambulance arrived and she was taken away for proper medical attention.
Although I've heard many stories from my uncle about his time as an EMT, this is the story that will stick with me until I die. About 6 years ago, my uncle Vinny's paramedic crew responded to a call from a hotel in Philly, and it was one of the more horrific experiences he's had. The initial report stated that a maintenance man named Mike went to check on room 417, since water had been reported flooding into the hallway, and it was he who found the body. Mike informed 911 that there was a man in the hot tub who appeared to be deceased, and he was all but hyperventilating as he tried to make his report. Mike relayed that he saw the man and immediately backed out of the room, being careful not to drop his phone into the several inches of water on the floor. My uncle's two-man paramedic team entered the room about 12 minutes later, and they almost gagged at the smell of feces and burning flesh. Vinny, who has a stomach of steel, had to press his hand to his mouth to keep from vomiting. The room was filled with steam, and the humidity was instantly making the men sweat profusely. Their grip on their equipment was slipping, and they knew they needed to extract the victim quickly. The naked man was floating in the hot tub, a maniacal grin plastered across his face. From the looks of it, the man had been in the water for a while, since his bruised skin was starting to peel off of his body in long, squishy strips. Vinny held his breath and checked for vitals, while one of the other EMTs went to get a bag for the body. Even though my uncle saw corpses regularly, this method of death was a disturbing first for him, and something about the whole situation was unnerving. As Vinny placed his fingers on the man's wrist, expecting to feel nothing, he had to choke back a startled scream when the victim's hand shot out and grasped his arm. It wasn't a corpse. The John Doe didn't show any other signs of being responsive, but when the other EMT went to check the man's eyes for a dilation reaction, his pupils looked slitted, almost like those of a reptile. Vinny was weirded out, but dismissed it as a side effect of getting boiled alive like a hard-boiled egg. As the men removed the victim from the hot tub, the man began to thrash, strips of flesh splattering on the EMTs. They tried to pin the man down to keep him from hurting himself, but he was shockingly strong. As the last bits of flesh dropped to the floor, Vinny saw that it wasn't more skin underneath, it was scales. His partner must have noticed too, because both men began screaming almost in unison. The thing began to growl, and my uncle's normal desire to figure out problems turned into sheer fight-or-flight response, with flight winning out. He ran from the hotel room, his teammate on his heels. They slammed the door behind them, and a moment later they heard one of the windows shatter. The men had no idea how to explain to their boss what happened, but after some phone calls, and a few men in black suits appearing, they were given a specific story to follow. They were told to say that a John Doe tried to drown himself, and that the mentally unhinged man climbed down the fire escape when his attempt failed. Vinny, who was paid extra well to keep his mouth shut, never did tell anyone about his story until he shared it with me the other day. I could tell he didn't want to, but I was the only one in the family that he thought would believe him.
Alright, my name is James Allen Gilbert, aka We the People, the Voice of the People of the World. I'm taking on the government in Akron, Ohio. Probably the federal government, we'll see. I've been told by people around me that they're manipulating videos against me. They have, I don't know, a duplicate, a shapeshifter, I don't know. But when you see it, I will guarantee you one thing, that is not me. You see, oh, say, can you see? You'll see me. You see what I look like now? Well, I look darn near the same. But watch around the eyes. Look in the eyes. See what you see. See if you see that spirit around him that's around me. That's not been lifted off another film and manipulated to be what it is. These people, these things, I should say, they have a human form, but they're not. They can turn into anything they wish to. You ever seen the Reptilians? Well, they're in a human body, or appear to be a human body, but they're not human. They're of the alien race. One of them, that is, here. You tell me. But I'm going to guarantee you one thing, as God is my witness. If anything was ever done to harm anyone, that was not me, because I don't do that. You see. Oh, say, can you see?
Dulce, a small town in New Mexico, is an area rich with ghostly and cryptid reports. In 2010, A. Gomez and 6 of her classmates had been out drinking and partying in the woods outside Dulce. At around 2:30 a.m., in the pitch black darkness, they began to walk down the main road to Gomez's car so that she could drive them home. She was the only girl in the group. As they walked towards the car, One of the friends demanded that she come home with him. She told him no, at which point this friend insisted that he was a Skinwalker, a legendary creature with the ability to transform at will. Of course, the other guys in the group began to chuckle at his absurd claim. A headlight soon appeared on the road, and Gomez, assuming that it was a cop out on patrol, told everyone to hide by the creek, which was just off the side of the road. They did, and it was a cop. As the cruiser passed by and continued on down the road, the moon appeared out from behind some clouds, illuminating the area. Gomez and her friends began to make their way out of the creek and back onto the road. That is when something very, very strange began to manifest. Their friend, who had insisted that he was a Skinwalker, suddenly fell down onto the ground and curled up into a fetal position. Gomez recalled thinking that he had dropped something, though she was shocked by what occurred next. In front of her and her friend's eyes, this friend transformed into what she could only describe as a dog, black in color with a long bushy tail. It proceeded to charge off in the direction where they had just come. Being that I wasn't as fast as the guys, I was screaming, running, trying to catch up. We finally made it to my vehicle and were all freaked out at what we just saw. Couldn't believe it because we knew this person since elementary school. We ended up all staying at my house in my room. Nobody wanted to leave.
We're working in another film together, and Julia was asking about the shapeshifting documentary, which I've been working on with the team for about a year and a half, and she has a shapeshifting story in her family that's been passed down from a few generations. And I noticed that since we've been making this documentary, a number of people in my life that I know very well have come to me with stories. Like maybe it wasn't the time to share them, or it's just something that was in families passed down, because I've never heard these stories, and then all of a sudden I'm hearing more and more, so it's super exciting.
Yeah, I don't think we tell the story much outside of our family, other than, until now, till people, close friends or whatnot, other family members. So just, I don't know, because it's family lore. So
Well, thank you for telling it. Like, I'm really excited.
sure, yeah,
So, tell me the story about your great-grandmother.
that's right. So this story was originally told to my father in French, and he translated it into English when he told me when I was younger. And it goes all the way back to my great-great-grandma Duquette. And she lived in northern New York, southern Canada region, near to the town at the time of Plattsburgh. And when times were tough, because she was a widow, she would bring in boarders and rent out a room in her home. So during the summer one year, she took in a young man who worked in Plattsburgh, who preferred to stay outside of the city in the woods, and so he rented from my great-great-grandmother. And he's a great tenant. He paid his rent on time and paid all of his bills. My grandmother fed him his meals, and everything was fine. However, one night of the year, or the month I mean, he would go missing for a few days. And she didn't question it or think anything of it. And then one day he came home from work, and he had to travel very far into the town, so he either rode or walked in. It took a really long time, so he'd kind of get home late, eat, and then go to sleep. Well, he went missing, and that night, and the next day she was up doing her chores and ironing and cleaning and whatnot, and she heard a wolf howling in the woods behind her cabin, behind the home that they shared. And she didn't think much of it. There was plenty of wildlife back then, so it wasn't uncommon, and she went about her business. Well, the evening started to settle in, and it became dusk, and she had one of those old-fashioned irons, like you would see back in the day, like an antique iron would have been contemporary at the time, on the stove. And stove was sort of near to a window that was open. And she's near the window and she looks out and there's a wolf sort of coming in the window towards her. And so just, totally scared her. She grabbed the iron and threw it at the wolf. And the iron hit the wolf in the face. And, I'm not sure, it either yelped or howled and, ran off into the woods and it was gone. And so the next day, the boarder didn't come home. So he went missing for several days. He didn't come home the next day. And the day after that, she didn't see anything of him. And then finally on the third day, she sees him walking up the road. And he's bandaged on the side of his face that she had hit the wolf with the iron. And the first thing he does, and this is very out of character for him, is just like, Miss Duquette, I'm going to move out now. And he paid the rest of his bills and he moved out immediately at that time, and she never heard from him or saw him again.
I found this very bizarre story in the World Globe, dated the 3rd of January 2018. The headline reads, "The Case of World's Werewolves" by Tom Sleman. So without further ado, let's get to the story, and I quote. In 2002 at BBC Radio Merseyside, I interviewed a former security guard who worked at a certain hospital in Whirl, and he told a chilling story that was later backed up by a porter, a policeman, and several nurses. The guard, Craig, not his real name, said that a heavily pregnant New Age traveler, aged about 25, was brought into the Whirl hospital after going into labor. She seemed delirious, and wanted to have her baby in a teepee, but an older man, possibly the woman's partner, brought her to the hospital, then quickly left. It was a warm summer night and a full moon was out, and the woman belonged to a community of hippies who had camped down in Bender tents and yurts on a tract of land close to the hospital. As the woman went into the throes of labor, the midwife and nurses attending to her saw the patient undergo a startling and very frightening transformation. The grimacing face of the young woman turned slowly into the face of some animal. The tip of her nose darkened, the skin became hairy and turned a strange grayish-pink color, and long pointed teeth protruded from the mouth. The midwife and nurses backed away from the bed in terror as the woman began to make snarling noises, and a security guard, Craig, was called. When Craig reached the ward, he saw the nurses run past him into the corridor, and then he saw a figure in hospital clothes which looked humanoid, only the face was that of an animal with a snout. This entity ran to the plate glass second-floor window and smashed it with its fists, before jumping through the frame into the garden. Craig reached the smashed window within seconds and caught a fleeting glimpse of the woman running off into the moonlit nightscape. Fearing the adverse publicity from this unearthly occurrence, the hospital managers advised the staff to say nothing about the incident, but some told their families and partners, and the story got out, but most who heard it classed the account as some urban legend. I mentioned the incident on a radio station and was besieged with calls from people, including the security guard Craig, nurses, a porter, and even a policeman who told me about a sighting of the apparently metamorphosed woman at a park near to the hospital. Inquiries were made at the travelers' encampment, but the police met a wall of silence. No one would admit to even knowing who the pregnant woman was. Days later the travelers were moved on. The whole affair continues to tantalize me. Was that pregnant lady a shape-shifting werewolf? And furthermore, what became of her and her child? I think it will be a long time before we know the answers.
I'm open to a lot of things and was not at all sceptical when my friend mentioned that she had seen a shapeshifter on the local reservation she lives near. She delivers newspapers and I helped her out for a month after she had some surgery done, We would talk about folklore and the customs and traditions because I've always been interested in that sort of thing, but never knew much about this particular tribe due to a lot of different things. She would tell me about seeing this big black dog on occasion, and when she would blink or look away and then look back, it'd be a woman. Always the same woman, just different ages. If it was anyone else telling me this, I would have thought trick of the light or being tired, etc. But from her, I believed it. One night, when I was with her, we pulled up to a man and a woman. We always offer papers to homeless or people walking around because you'd be amazed at how happy someone can get just by the gesture of it, let alone having a paper. They both accepted the paper, and when the woman grabbed hers, my friend tensed and I froze. She was very nice in the 10-second interaction we had, but it was almost like she had sent a tendril of energy up my friend's arm and around the cab of the truck, as if to say,
I know you, but don't mess with me.
But not in a menacing manner, just pretty much like a warning shot of a gun. After they had walked away, and we were heading up the road, my friend had stated that was the wolf woman, and if I felt what she did, and I nodded to her. We spent the next hour in silence, still feeling it roll through us. My friend got the full brunt of it, I'm sure, but I got a pretty powerful kickback as well. It was like a light of electricity, arcing and dancing from nerve to nerve, creating goosebumps and shivers on occasion. It wasn't overall a bad experience at all, rather the opposite. Just not really something you'd expect to happen as casual as it did. I really miss going on that route, always something interesting, but that was the first time in a long time that I was reminded of the universe being bigger than what we see.
In Cartusa, Oklahoma, a witness, Linda C., claims that she observed a very strange sight while leaving work one night in June 2019. It had been raining that night and was still wet as she exited the factory where she worked and began making her way across the darkened parking lot towards her car. I parked by this maroon-looking car. I think it was a Cadillac. The window seemed half wet towards the bottom half of the window. I just happened to look. I seen a girl sitting on the passenger side. She had brownish black shoulder-length hair. I waved at her thinking she might work here. When I got to the driver's side of the car, I looked again. I had to look twice. She had a pointy nose, a lot of hair. She looked like a wolf. Still not believing what she was seeing, Linda got into her car and proceeded to back up. As she did this, she pointed her headlights directly at the car. I looked again and seen what looked like a werewolf. Instead of turning around, she ducked down in the seat. I just kept going. Linda attempted to bring it up at work the next night, though her co-workers did not want to discuss it. She admits that there were more details about that evening she does not feel comfortable or safe discussing. She wonders, though, did she actually see a girl transform into a werewolf right in front of her eyes? I know what I saw. I'm not crazy. No one wants to talk about it, so I just leave it alone.
Now, a couple of weeks ago in Ghana, Africa, farmers started to notice that their livestock was getting killed and eaten by a mysterious predator. The way these animals were being attacked was just very odd and unusual, as sometimes only the liver would be eaten, or it would be just the heart or the intestines, just some random body part. So this made no sense at all, as this is not how a predator attacks and kills its prey. So everybody within this area was scared and on the lookout while hunters were trying to catch or kill whatever this was. Then eyewitnesses started to come forward, and they were saying some very strange and terrifying things. They said that they had encountered a shapeshifter. On several occasions, villagers claimed that they had seen this entity turn into a pig or some random animal, and once they realized that it was being watched, it would run after them, then it would just disappear. And these stories only created more hysteria among these people. Then not too long after these sightings, a hunter saw it. He claimed that he watched a shapeshifter turn into a human, then back into a wild animal, and he shot at it. Then it just sprouted wings and flew away. And I guess this hunter must have wounded it, because it didn't get far. It landed on a nearby farm, and the police were able to catch it, thanks to a witch doctor or a man who knew how to stop it from changing forms. Now, the interesting thing about this case is, even the police claimed that they had seen it shapeshift several times before it finally stopped in the form of a small man. And this man cannot speak. And it seems that the people within this region believe that this is not a human being at all, but more like an entity or a magical creature. Now I think that this is just a case of superstition mixed in with a little bit of hysteria. But one thing is for sure, the people who live here believe without a shadow of a doubt that this man is a shapeshifter. And that does scare me because I do not want anything bad to happen to this person, as it seems since he can't talk, that he might be special, if you know what I mean. And maybe they are targeting him for being a little bit different.
The following night, Yilmaz was reading at his home where he lived alone. At around 9:30 p.m., he heard knocking on the door. Yilmaz thought it strange that somebody would come calling so late in the evening. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see 3 young men in their 30s, whom he had never seen or met before. All 3 appeared very much human, and all were dressed in uniformly black suits and black ties. Given that he had lived and worked his entire life in that small town, and knew pretty much everybody, he found it odd that these people were complete strangers. Turkish tradition dictated that he let them in, and they agreed, moving into the living room where they took a seat. The visitors indicated to Yilmaz that they were from another town 5 miles away. Attempting to be hospitable, Yilmaz excused himself to go make some tea. When he returned to the living room some 2 minutes later, he was surprised to find that his guests were now gone. Having not heard them leave, he assumed that they were still in his house. He searched every room but came up empty. Apparently his visitors had shown themselves out, even though he found this to be unlikely. In order for them to leave, they would have had to go out the main and only door, though to get to that door, they would have had to have passed by the kitchen where Yilmaz was, and he was certain he would have seen them. He was also certain that they had not crawled out any windows, because all his windows had bars on them. So where did they go? Venturing outside, he noticed a little girl, one of the neighbor's kids, playing by herself in her yard. He asked her if she saw the 3 men leave his house. She replied simply, yes, and pointed to the corner of the street. Yilmaz looked to where she was pointing and observed, to his utter surprise, 3 black dogs looking back at him. They eventually turned and wandered off down the road. Yilmaz remained outside looking around. Just then, another neighbor, a woman, came running down the street, screaming in panic that she had just seen 3 men flying into the sky. This case is interesting as it starts with a UFO sighting and then quickly veers into the absolute bizarre. Yilmaz could not estimate time surrounding the sighting and how long he stayed out there watching it. This definitely hints at some type of missing time. The arrival of the men in black also seems curious. Had they arrived merely to tell him that they were from a town 5 miles away, or did something else occur in that living room that Yilmaz could not consciously recall? For me, the strangest aspect of the case is not that they could seemingly teleport out of a house onto a street, or that they could fly, or in the very least be lifted into the sky into a craft waiting overhead. It's the appearance of the 3 black dogs. Black dogs are a mainstay in the paranormal, popping up everywhere from graveyards to UFOs, and in one case I mentioned previously, as a companion to a Bigfoot. Were these MIBs able to shapeshift into dogs? And might this case provide answers to the thousands of out-of-place animal sighting reports from around the world? Just something to think about.
I invite you to follow along as Ernest spins his fantastic tale. I visited Spokane on a sales trip in the summer of 2004. I was then, as I am now, employed by a major electronics distribution firm that had a number of clients and prospects in the region. This was a 4-day trip, which, depending on the client, typically involves a little wining and dining, as well as other activities. A fair amount of my clients are younger and game for just about anything. I have hiked, skied, and fished with more than a few of them. But on this particular day, I had no takers, so I was braving the Quartz Mountain lookout trail alone. I was told that there were some fantastic views of the surrounding area once you reach the fire lookout station. Now, as I begin, I must tell you that this isn't called Quartz Mountain for nothing. In fact, the mountain is predominantly made up of quartz. In the world of the paranormal, quartz and limestone are said to be engines for weird and strange occurrences. I mention this now because what I am about to unveil to you and your readers is very strange indeed. I began my day's hike up to the fire tower. There are actually a number of trails that you can take up the mountain, all of which vary on the level of difficulty. Relatively speaking, the first 3/4 of the hike was uneventful. It was on the last quarter where the trail started to tighten up and became closely flanked by hanging branches and trees. Once I had made it to the top, I climbed up into the fire tower to have a look around and eat a bite of food. And from that point, 4 lakes were visible sprawling across the surrounding area. I knew all of their names: Spirit, Hauser, Newman, and Liberty. I was checking out the lay of the land with my binoculars when my eyes locked onto something white moving around on a grassy field far below me. It was too far to tell for certain, but it appeared to be a small girl wearing a white dress with no shoes on. She was frolicking in this field just like any other small child would. I watched her spin and run around the field for almost 20 minutes, and I kept saying to myself that at any moment someone would surely come into the field to get her. I mean, she couldn't be out there alone, unless, of course, she had somehow gotten lost. Finally, my fatherly instincts kicked in, and I decided that I had to go down and try and locate her. What if she was really lost? She could die out here and nobody would know. I couldn't walk away from here without knowing she was okay. I estimated the distance between us and figured out which trail was the most direct before I departed from the fire station, heading in her direction. Once I entered the trails, I could no longer keep an eye on her. It was a blind hike downhill, and I could only hope that I was heading in the right direction. A strong sense of urgency had welled up within me about this little girl, and I was going down the slope at a frantic pace, hoping that the forest would break open, revealing the field as quickly as possible. After about 30 minutes, the forest gave way and I entered a field. Immediately, I started to look in every direction, searching for the small child, but I didn't see her anywhere. I thought that maybe I had found the wrong field. I was about to continue onward when I heard what sounded like a little girl singing, but it was very faint. Frantically, I started to look around in every direction, when suddenly, standing far out in the field, was the little girl. I couldn't understand it. I had just looked in that same direction and saw nothing. There was nothing in this field to hide behind, yet there she was, dancing around as though she had been standing there all along. She couldn't have just run out there in a matter of seconds. For a moment, I could only stand where I was and question my own sanity. After a long moment, I yelled, "Little girl, are you lost?" She didn't respond at all. she just kept skipping, dancing, and singing. I shouted again, taking care to raise my voice. "Hey there, little girl, are you all right?" Suddenly, she stopped dancing and just stood with her back to me. My hair is actually standing up as I am telling you this, because what happens next is out of this world. That little girl, wearing a white flowing dress and no shoes, was perhaps 80 to 100 yards away from me. And she suddenly started to transform before my very eyes. The dress seemed to melt away from her as she grew and began to turn dark. I wanted to run, but I was frozen where I stood. There, right where that girl had been standing mere seconds ago, was a monster. I grabbed the sides of my head and fell to the ground. I thought that I must have had a stroke and I was going to die here, delusional and alone. All I could do was lie there in the grass, holding my head and trying to sort out the pieces of what was happening. After a time, I rolled onto my side and sat up. Once again, my eyes fell upon that monster as it walked away. It crossed the length of the field before disappearing into the trees. Even when it was gone, I remained where I was. Even now, I am unsure how long I sat there, not being able to come to grips with what I had just seen. I spun my yarn quickly and with a great deal of personal shame. At some moment, I managed to get back to my feet. I managed to get my feet back under me and made my way back to my car.
Hey everybody, it's Murphy Grey Hunter. It is Thursday night, November 10th. I think it's about 7:30, almost 8 o'clock. And I wanted to do a video of on my grandmother, another grandma story. Okay, so again, you have to remember these are just stories that were told to us as children, and then of course again as adults, asking questions about the Lechuza. This is the story we're going to talk about, the Lechuza. I was just at my aunt's house, which is my grandmother's house, maybe about 9 months ago, and my aunt, the one who says she doesn't practice witchcraft and who has my grandma's book, she was telling me a little more about the Lechuza. So let me show y'all a picture of a Lechuza. Well, those of you who don't know, a Lechuza is considered to be like an owl, okay? Legend has it that the Lechuza was a witch who was exposed for practicing magic. The angry town folks went on a rampage and they killed her. And it said that she returned from the grave hell-bent on seeking revenge on those who murdered her and intoxicated people. I guess that's a Sunday school version, right? I don't know. And so, let me show you the picture that I was looking at. This is a picture. Okay. Alright, so I'm going to read you a little more about the Lechuza, and then I'm going to tell you the stories that I heard. Okay, so again, the legend is that the Lechuza was a witch who was exposed for practicing magic. And they, the town people killed her, so she was coming back to seeking revenge on the people who murdered her and intoxicated people. Descriptions of her said that she's a shapeshifter, and she appears as a ghostly witch or a human-sized bird with a woman's face. Let me see what else it says here. Apparently the Lechuza has supernatural powers and can transform into a large bird, mostly common as an owl. Her face is that of a beautiful wise woman, and in some sense of a siren of a feathery sorts. It says that she lures her prey into with an eerie sound resembling a newborn baby's cry. Of course, if you hear the helpless cry of a baby in the dark of the night, you would find it and try to, locate it and help it. That's how she will lure you there. When Lechuza strikes, she swoops down on her victim like in a banshee manner, and they're never seen again. They said that hearing a bird in the night is an omen that Lechuza is about. Okay, I was just kind of reading the stuff here. Okay, so I'm pretty sure there's more to it than just that, but so with that being said, so my if you watched one of my other videos where I was talking about my my grandma, I told you that there were several times that I would hear a crying in my grandma's room. I would hear like a baby crying all the time, and I would go in there and I would look all in the closet, and I would never find a baby. I could hear it crying, but I could never find one. And it was always in the closet, and her room was always so dark and so cold and just so but I literally heard a baby crying. I was trying to see if they had another picture, but they don't. Anyway, so we were always told the story about the Lechuza's going to come, and my grandma would always talk about that there was a Lechuza, and she would always tell us not to go outside at night because there was a Lechuza that would come and see her. Well, we were kids, we just thought she was telling us that so we would come in and be in at a certain time or whatever. I don't know. I don't know to this point if that was true or what. But, so, those months ago when I went to go see my aunt again, I don't just randomly go to my aunt's house. My aunt lives in the little town of Loch. And we go there because there's like a haunted school that we like to go and visit there. There's a lot of lavender that grows freely there, just wild, right? We pick lavender. I do photo shoots, so sometimes I go to the little town because I love the old town look, and I'll do photos. And I went in, I collected some graveyard dirt from my grandparents' graveyard. I mean, where their headstones were, from my mother's mom and from my father's parents. I went there to go collect dirt, and then while I was there, I collected dirt from a church, and I collected dirt from, just different places while I was there. And so I ran by there to see if she was there. And so she was outside, and they have a garage sale like every weekend, because this was like a Friday when I went. So every weekend they sell like stuff because her boyfriend or husband, I don't know who he is to her, he helps this company, like when they evict someone, they throw all their stuff out. Well, or some people just up and move. So they go and they help clean out all the stuff. And so when they're doing that, I guess they let them keep whatever they clean out. So he always brings stuff home, and then my aunt will go through it, and whatever she doesn't want, she sells, and that they make extra money that way. And so she was having a garage, so she was outside, and we were out there talking to her. And then she was telling me that she says, there's this big tree in the front part of my grandmother's property. And right underneath that tree, she had a swing there. She would always be on the swing. She would always be outside on the swing all day long, right? And it was like one of those long bench swings, Anyway, and that tree has like some history to it, right? And I think I kind of talked about that in one of the other videos. But anyway, it's a big old tree. And we used to have like a little tree house up there. And I told you, I remember my cousin being thrown off of that tree one time, literally just grabbed and thrown out. It freaked us out. But anyway, we were sitting there talking, and then she says, do you remember when mom, she would call mom, used to talk about the Lechuza? And I'm like, yeah, but I was little, I don't really remember too much about that. And she said, she says, well, the Lechuza still comes. It still comes here at night. And I'm like, what? I thought it was just like, story or whatever. But she said that one time she heard like some screeching noise outside. And right across the street from my grandmother's property is a church. Like literally right across the street. And so she said she looked out the window and she saw this woman across the street, like right in front of the church, looking at the house. And she was just kind of like looking down like this. And she was just standing there and her head was down, but her eyes were looking up, right? And she says she was looking at her, right? Through the window, she was looking at her. And she said the woman was dressed in white, but it was like dingy, dirty white dress type of thing, right? And she said that she had this long hair, like long kind of dirty, greasy looking hair, just kind of hung down, and she could tell she was a woman, but something was wrong with her face, right? Anyway, she just kept looking, and she said she saw the woman walking towards her, and kind of like in a fast kind of like pace, almost kind of like a running. And then she said she turned into a bird, right? She turned into a bird and she flew away. And she said she could hear the screeching. And now this is what she told me. Now, mind you, my aunt is an alcoholic. So, I mean, I'm not saying that it's not true, but I don't know. This is just what she's telling me. So she says, then she says, another time, she says, she goes, do you see the tree right here? And I said, yeah. She goes, look at that limb. And so it's a branch way on the top, and it's a really thick one. And on the branch, like say this is the branch, you could see like where something had its claws on there. So like this, right? But of course it's big, but you could see the claw marks, right? Like where whatever was holding it was gripping it, right? Sorry, I just don't want this to get cold. And so you could see where it was like gripping it, because you could see the lines all on the trunk of the tree branch or limb, because it was a big one. She says that's where the Lechuza sits at night, and she screams and screeches out to me. And then I go, have you seen it? And she's like, yeah. She says, it's a big owl. It's like a big bird. It looks like an owl. It's big, but scary looking. And she says, I don't come out. I just know because I've seen it. So then, she said one time she was coming home and it was late already. And she said she was walking in, and the Lechuza was there up on the branch, like screeching at her, and had this like pose, like it was gonna come down at her, like it was positioned like it was gonna come down and grab her, right? She could tell it was already gonna come down. And she said she got really scared. She said she couldn't move or anything, and she could just hear it screeching. And then she said to the right side of her, there is another tree there. It's not like an old tree. It's still fairly like young looking tree. But anyway, she said up in that tree area, she said she saw a white light. It was like a big bright white light. Now she said this was at night, so she says it was a big bright white light that just got brighter and brighter. And she said it got really bright to the point to where it scared the Lechuza away. And then she looked at the light and she says she said she swore she saw her mom's face, my grandmother's face, in the light. And so then she said she ran in, and she said she's never seen that again. And she said she's never seen, at that time that I went over there, that was about 9 months ago, she said it had never returned. But I don't know, I don't know if it's returned since then or not. But that's the story that she told about the Lechuza. Now, my oldest daughter, she said that she was talking to a co-worker who also lives in that small town. And she said that, her and the co-worker never talked about, never talked about witchcraft or, anything like that. I think she was, I don't know how they started up on this conversation. I think because she was staying a little bit later, so my daughter could come in later, because we had went to Loch that day. And I think she had told her I went to Loch or whatever, or something like that. And she says, oh yeah, that's where I'm from. And she goes, oh really? She's like, yeah. She goes, do you want to hear a crazy story that my husband told me? And she's like, yeah. She said, this was like an older Hispanic woman. And so she says, now mind you, this co-worker had no idea that my daughter is into witchcraft or, any of this stuff, right? And so she said that her husband was a bartender at this bar, small bar in Lockhart. And he said that one night this woman walked in, and he said that she was real strange looking, like real dirty looking, and she had on a white dress, but all dingy and dirty, and her hair was long and straggly down, and all greasy and stuff, right? And she had a woman's face, but her nose area here looked kind of like a bird. And that he asked her if she wanted something to drink, and she said, or I don't know if she said or he just gave her a beer. I don't really remember how she got the beer. But he said that she drank that beer down so fast. He had never seen anybody drink a beer so fast. Like just literally gulped it down like in one gulp. And then she looked at him and made this horrible screeching noise and ran out of the bar. And then so he followed her out of the bar, and that he saw that she turned into a bird. And he knew that was the Lechuza, and that he had never been so scared in all his life. So I have no idea what brings upon the Lechuza to somebody's life. I don't know. I've heard so many stories of the Lechuza where someone can summon that to you, send a Lechuza to you as a target, or that the Lechuza targets you out, or I don't know how it is that she comes about. I don't know enough about her. But anyway, I just thought I'd share another one of my grandma's stories. I hope y'all like that. If y'all have any stories of Lechuza or any information or anything, yeah, please let me know. I think I'm going to do some research on the Lechuza. I really like doing research on a lot of these folklore. I love folklore. That word is so hard for me to say. Folklore. It does not roll off the tongue. Okay. I love those types of stories that are they're true, but they're so old, like old stories. I love all that stuff. And so anyway, I hope you guys liked it. As always, I love y'all, and blessed be. Bye.
On October 19, 2012, two brothers in Brackettville, Texas, were sitting outside on their porch enjoying a couple of beers. For some reason, one of the men felt compelled to look skyward. What he saw frightened him. Flying over his house were at least 20 gigantic owl-like creatures. It scared me enough to go inside and lock the doors, he said. Such stories of gigantic human-sized owls, called the Lechuza, are common in New Mexico and Texas. Most of the time, stories involving the Lechuza are bizarre, sometimes accompanied by strange lights, missing time, and other anomalies. Two men four-wheeling on a ranch near the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico in the late 2000s had a front row seat to the Lechuza phenomena and all of its weirdness. It was around midnight, and they had been drinking and zipping around on their ATVs. As they neared Black's Bridge, they observed yellow eyes about 100 yards in front of them. Just then the ATV shut off, lights and everything. We had only drank a few beers, so we know we weren't drunk. The eyes started coming closer. We started to hear a baby crying, and soon after a lady's voice calling the name Sophia right in front of us. Feeling spooked, the two men retrieved their guns, which they carried with them on their vehicles. Suddenly a woman appeared out of the darkness. She was crying and asking for her baby. If that wasn't strange enough, from the left side of the riverbank, they began hearing what sounded like a baby crying. Assuming that a mother and her baby had run into trouble and had become separated, the two men proceeded towards the sound of the baby crying, looking to find it and get it back to its mother, and then get them to the hospital. As they moved down the riverbank, using the light of the moon, the crying got louder and louder. They soon began hearing what sounded like whistling coming first from above and then in front of them. They spun around and noticed that the lady was now gone. When they turned back towards the sound of the crying baby, they received the shock of their life. Standing in front of them, lit up by the light of the moon, was a huge, 5-foot-tall gray owl. The two men couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had both seen owls before, but never one this big. The sight of this human-sized owl frightened them, and they drew their weapons at the creature, which hissed at them and then flew off. The two men ran back to their ATVs. As they ran, they looked skywards and observed 3 of these human-sized owls flying around, making strange noises that, to them, mimicked the sound of a baby crying. The two men fired at them, but they continued to circle, eventually flying off after about 10 minutes. They spoke to a sheriff about their sighting when they got home, but they didn't think he believed them. If things couldn't get any stranger, the next day, the two men were eating breakfast at a diner in Old Mesilla, New Mexico, talking to themselves about what had happened the previous night, when a woman approached them. They described her as beautiful. She proceeded to tell them, "Don't be afraid of us. We are not after you. You cannot kill us with your guns," she told them, apparently revealing herself to be anything but human. She further insisted that they would almost certainly have been killed had they not intervened. With that, she smiled, turned around, and walked away. While it's possible that she had overheard them talking in the diner and decided to pull a prank, the man believes that, given the events of the night before, it is more likely that he and his friend may have encountered the Lechuza.
Another case comes from a young girl who was taking a trip to see her grandmother, and her grandmother was full-blooded Native American. And one day this young girl was playing outside when she heard her grandmother screaming at her little brother to come here and to get away from it. So this young girl thought that her little brother must have found a scorpion or maybe even a rattlesnake. But to her surprise, it was a very unnatural, huge-looking dog, and it just sat there staring at her grandmother. And after a minute or so, it finally took off, and the grandmother said that the Skinwalker had finally found me, and she moved away right after this encounter. Now this young girl couldn't remember if the dog took off at amazing speeds, because that is what Skinwalkers are kind of famous for, but she does remember that it was huge and its eyes were a very creepy yellowish color. And she also knew that her grandmother truly believed that it was a Skinwalker.
This is a weird one, this one. It's a video I wanted to make for a while, and I didn't really know how to approach it because I've told people this story in person, and the first thing they say is, "Oh, it was like the movie They Live." And I say, "No, it was nothing like the movie They Live." Or they say, "Oh, it was like a reptilian." And I says, "No, it wasn't a reptilian." Then I say, "Oh, it was like an alien." And I says, "No, it was nothing like an alien." But I actually saw a shape-shifting thing when I was about, I'd say I was about 16, 17. It was something that I didn't talk about publicly until I saw Billy Corgan of the Smashing Pumpkins mention it on Howard Stern. And what made me want to do this then was, when I posted that story on Facebook, I'd mentioned this had happened to me in a way, and some of the people said, yeah, I'd had similar experiences. And then people said, well, tell us about what it was like. Okay, here's what it was like. It was a midweek in the early 1980s. Myself and my friend were on a street in Dublin called Dorset Street. It's even today it's kind of a rundown part of the city. Trying to get home in the afternoon, and then in those days they had, well, they still had them, the double-decker buses. They had the stairs ascended up to the second tier, the second deck, and they came up in the middle of the bus. And as you came up them, you saw basically the back end of the bus. So you ascend the stairs, you get up onto the top deck, and then you naturally, and being teenagers anyway, you would go towards the back, okay, at the upper deck. Unless you're a little kid, you'd go to the front to see the scenery. So we ascended got on the bus, paid the fare, ascended the second floor, second deck, and right behind the sort of stair area, there's two immediate seats. It's the seats that who's ever sitting on it can see every single person coming up the stairs. And there was sitting a kid wearing a leather jacket, and his face was all distorted, next to another kid he was talking to, who was a normal looking kid, about the same age as us, 16 again. What I saw disturbed me, frightened me, upset me, and shocked me. The face was in the wrong position. One eyeball was up on the top of this forehead. The other eyeball was sort of down here. The face had skin that looked like it was made from plaster of Paris that had been painted with coffee or something. Crusty almost and hard. The mouth was kind of hanging down this side, and there was no hair that went to about here, with sort of straggly hair coming forward on the odd position. I thought he had been horrifically damaged in an accident, or burnt, or deformed, or something. I sit at the back of the bus with my mate Evo, and I says, Evo, did you see that kid at the front, at the stairs? And I said, no. I said, that kid with his back to us with the black hair and the leather jacket. He says, no. I said, his face, he's like the most distorted face I've ever seen. Like he must have been on a fire. He had some kind of really bad birth defects. And so I'm sitting at the back of the bus. I can see the back of this kid and the stairs, and I'm expecting to see everybody come up the bus to do a double take at seeing this kid's face. And they came up the stairs, and no one did a double take. They just glanced in that direction, looked away. The bus conductor came up to collect the fares. I was thinking he must be the most professional bus conductor in the world, because he didn't seem to be bothered by what he saw. And I'm thinking, this is all fucked up. So there I am on the bus, and so I said, I have to see this kid one last time, and though I don't want to. Now I was having, when I say I was disturbed by seeing this kid's face on the bus, it wasn't that I was really upset that he was so deformed although I think there was an element of that, I felt like I had been raped. I felt like I'd been molested at some kind of deep psychic level. I felt like I had been assaulted, like his physical appearance had actually damaged me on some level. And as I was leaving the bus, it was almost like one of these things, I don't want to look at him, I don't want to see him, but I have to kind of look anyway. And when we got to the top of we were getting off at our stop, and we walked off the bus, and as I was going down the stairs, I took a glance at him, expecting to see this monster face, and what I saw was a completely normal kid. He had all his eyes and mouth and everything in the right position. He had normal skin, and his hair was no longer all the way back here with a few kind of striggles. It was actually a full head of black, thick teenage boys' hair. And that's at the time when a lot of boys had thick, long hair. And I just never thought about it ever again. Or well, I did think about it, but I never gave it a lot of consideration. And I went on with my life, always having this icky feeling whenever I thought about this kid, whenever I remembered him. And it wasn't until years later that I realised he was a shapeshifter. Now, what did this mean about this kid? I don't know. Was he an evil kid? I'm not going to say that. Was I seeing his true form? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, I didn't know him. I could never follow his life to see if he turned out to be a serial killer or something like that. But it was a shapeshifter. Now, it was not a shapeshifter turning into a reptilian alien, like you're told these stories, or it wasn't a shapeshifter turning into a, I don't know, a demon with horns and spikes. His shapeshifting was literally his face was not able to compose itself within this reality. That's the way I would describe it. His face was not compatible with reality. At the time, I didn't drink, I didn't smoke, I didn't do drugs, I didn't do anything. I was actually a very well-behaved teenager. I was just into comics and books and things like sci-fi and horror. That was that kind of thing. I was a pretty typical teenager that way. Didn't touch drugs or drink or anything. And yeah, that was it. That kid was a shapeshifter, but it was nothing like what they tell us shapeshifters are supposed to be like, where they grow wings or they turn into animals or something like that. It was like his face was no longer compatible with this reality, and it was starting to fall apart in a visual sense. And that's, if you've had any experience like this, I'd like to hear them. I've already had a few people on my Facebook page say that they've had these similar experiences, but let me know, because it's one that's always stuck with me. I can't explain it. There's nothing that would be connected to what I was doing at the time that made it happen, but by Jesus, it left me in an awful state. I mean, I'm talking about a sickly feeling of, at some deep psychic energetic level, I'd been damaged. Like I said, it felt like I'd been raped visually, if such a thing is possible.
One of the more credible encounters that I have ever come across comes from a tribal police officer. One day he was driving on the highway and it was very lightly snowing when he saw what he thought was an older Navajo woman dressed in very traditional clothing walking on the side of the road. And this was very odd to him because there was nothing even close to this area. So he wondered, where was she coming from and where was she going? So this officer turned around to see if he can give her a lift, but she disappeared. She was nowhere to be seen. So he got out of his police car so he could scan the horizon and hopefully find out where she went. But he couldn't see her anywhere. But he did stumble upon some fresh footprints in the snow. So very curious, he decided to follow them. And while he was following them, he noticed that the footprints started to change. They turned into a dog or coyote prints. And this really scared him, so he ran back to his patrol car. And later that day, he told another tribal officer about what he had just witnessed. And this other officer told him that he had heard stories about this before, and it only seems to happen on that stretch of highway, and only while it's snowing. Sometimes it's an older woman, and sometimes it's a younger, very beautiful woman. And what they are doing is hitchhiking, making some of these Navajo officers believe that they are skinwalkers looking for victims. as who wouldn't pick up an older or younger woman while it was snowing in the middle of nowhere? Making me wonder if skinwalkers are involved in some of these missing 411 cases, as it seems that these magical beings like to hitchhike, follow people, and just scare us to death. And just maybe these stories that we do hear about are from the lucky ones that got away. Or maybe some skinwalkers aren't as evil as others. Now, I would really like to continue the series, but it's hard for me to find good, credible skinwalker sightings. So if you know of any, please let me know in the comment section below.
The year was 1994 and I was about 14 years old, and my friends and I, we all ranged in ages between 13 and 16 years old. So something we all seemed to do on the weekends, we always ended up at my house. I think probably because my parents or my household was a little bit more permissive. My father was always off on the weekends playing in his band and wouldn't come home till late at night, and my mother really didn't give a crap what we did. So we would always end up in my room, and eventually the lights would go off. We would all pile onto my bed and listen to music. And the music we listened to always had to be something dark and daydreamy and melancholy, and we'd just talk. Surprisingly deep discussions for people of our age. This one particular night, there was a girl who lived down the street from me. She was a little bit older, and her name, I'm going to change her name, we'll call her Amber. And Amber wasn't into the alternative scene, she wasn't goth in any way, but regardless, she was still very accepting of us, and vice versa. So it's a Friday night, and Amber's family is hosting some sort of religious function at their house, and one of the families are bringing a teenage son that's Amber's age, and kind of pawned him off on her, and she was really uncomfortable about it and asked if she could just bring him to our house. Well, I say our house like it was my friend's house, but she asked if she could bring him to my house and hang out, and I said, sure, why not? The more the merrier. It was me, my friend Elena, Jen, and Anissa. And we were there, we're listening to Sisters of Mercy in my room, and no more than 10 minutes go by and there's a knock at my door. And as we make our way down the stairs, my mom had already let them in. The person who she brings with her came into view, and it's like we all caught a glimpse of him at the same time, and we stopped dead in our tracks and our jaws dropped. And the reason that this happened was because we were incredibly into this movie Hideaway at the time, and if you've never seen it, definitely recommend it. I'm going to put a link in the description below. But the reason that we were so into this movie, well, one of the reasons, other than the fact that it was really cool, was one of the main characters, whose name is Visago, who was the most gorgeous goth guy ever, who was also a demon and a serial killer, but we were obsessed with him. You know, teen logic, right? This guy that she brought with her, he looked exactly like Visago. The same hair length, the same cut, same in the face. He even dressed exactly like Visago, and the weirdest part is that he'd never even seen the movie. We found this out later. So as we're all stood there, frozen in our tracks, mouth agape, he breaks the silence and says, "Oh, Sisters of Mercy," because he hears it coming from my room. And we're like, he's a real goth too. So our personal Visago's name was Brian, and we invite Brian upstairs into my bedroom, and he falls right into the sprawled out on my bed with the lights off and listening to music. He is a very mysterious, deep, and interesting person, much like Visago, minus the murder. We're laying there, and he suddenly says, "Do you want to see something cool?" We're like, "Sure." And he says, "I'm going to change my face." What? He said, "I'm going to change my face into something else. Watch." So he sits up on my bed, and the only light in the room that's coming in is the moonlight, but our eyes have adjusted to the point where we can see each other's faces quite clearly. We're watching his face, we're all facing him, and his face, it collapsed, sort of, we watched it sort of like in a succession of three, like, choo, 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 collapsed. And suddenly, it was a lion's face. He legit had the face of a fucking lion. And we, of course, what's your natural reaction? We start screaming. My friend Anissa lifted open my window, which is just above my bed, and threw up onto the deck below. I had to clean that up later. None of us could explain how he did that. And of course, what is the first thing you say to a person that does something like that? How did you do that? And he just laughed and thought it was funny. We're like, no. How did you do that? And he said, do you want to see other faces? And that night he proceeded to not only show us his different faces, which he said were faces that he had in a past life, but also his protector face, which was the lion, and then a robot face, which was something that he said he used on the astral plane. He talked about the astral plane quite a lot. Brian came to be a fixture every weekend. He would come and hang out. And every weekend, his presence was always something very dark and very mysterious. And we were just enthralled by him. He even showed us how to change our faces, and we would look at each other and we would watch each other's faces change. And this went on for probably, I would say, every weekend for about 2 months, and then he disappeared. That was it. We hadn't seen nor heard anything from him, and even his phone number was disconnected. It was like he disappeared into thin air. This is a memory that has always very vividly stuck out in my mind, and if I think back, I could still clearly see his face change, and our faces change, and my adult brain cannot make heads or tails of how that is physically possible. And over the years, I've told people this story before, and of course they look at me like I'm crazy and they ask me, oh, well, what drugs were you on? I could say with absolute certainty I have never touched a drug in my life, and I was stone cold sober that night, as were my friends. So over the years, we talked about it, and we all tried to make heads or tails of it. And as far as myself, I have many different beliefs. I'm agnostic, but I'm spiritual, so my belief system is just a mishmash of a lot of different things. And shapeshifters are not in that category. They do not fall into my line of beliefs. But here I am with a memory of what only can be described as somebody who shapeshifted right in front of my face. And apparently I did it too, because everyone saw my face change. And I saw my friend's face change vividly. I can remember this. And as an adult, I cannot make heads or tails of it. And it was making me crazy. So one night, I was on Facebook. And I was like, I'm going to search for this guy. I'm going to find him. I'm going to use my FBI freaking Google foo. Anything I can come up with, I'm going to find him. And I did. He was actually just on Facebook. I just had to type in his name. It wasn't really that much detective work that had to go into that. So I found him, and I sent him a message, sent him a friend's request, and I wasted no time. I just went right in there. And I asked him, I'm like, okay, you need to tell me, what the hell was that? I have very vivid memories of a human's face changing right before my very eyes. That doesn't make any sense. I need to understand why I have these memories, and I need to understand how you did that. And he said, I didn't do anything. You did it. And I was a little taken aback by that, and I said, no, I definitely did not do that. He said, no, you did. You saw what it was that you wanted to see. I just can't accept his explanation. It just does not make sense to me, because it would have to be some sort of collective hallucination for that to make any sort of sense. We all saw the same thing. It couldn't have just been me. How did we all see the same exact thing? It never happened before him. It never happened after him. And we tried after he disappeared, and we just could not do it. But he maintains to this day that it was entirely what it was I wanted to see. So I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. I just annoyingly have a memory that defies logic, reason, physics. It just defies everything. And have any of you ever experienced anything like this at all? Do you have a person in your life that only when they were around did things just get weird? Well, I'm happy that my friends were there, because had it not been for them, I would think that I was absolutely insane. But the fact that they were there and we all remember the same exact thing, it helps. We don't have answers, but it certainly does help. So that is my spooky tale, my encounter with the unknown.
Makwamosa, the Bear Walker Cult, an Indian Legend by Dennis Michael Morrison. This appeared first in Indian Artifact magazine way back in 1991. The Indian people of North and South America have what is, in my opinion, the most colorful culture that has ever existed on old planet Earth. Mythology and legend has always been, and continues to be, a very large part of that culture. Despite beautiful relics made by hand and left behind for us to discover and admire, their fantasy world is, to me, the most interesting thing about them. In the Indians' legends and myths are revealed to us much about the Indian mind. Here in Michigan, we have the wonderful Hiawatha legends. These feature such unique characters as the trickster Manabazo, and the great hare called Mishibao, and the dark and evil one, the Wendigos, who were cannibal giants. It is said that many legends have a basis in truth. This could be true of the Wendigos. Here in Greenbush, Michigan, were found the remains of human beings of extremely large size in antiquity. It's also no longer any secret that cannibalism was practiced to a degree in the Great Lakes region. There is a legend from this area that is a little known and quite mysterious. It is a legend of a dark secret power that was used in antiquity and still weaves its web today. This is the power of the Makwamosa, or the Bear Walker cult. It is claimed that this is the Indian equivalent of white man's witchcraft. Recently, I was granted a videotaped interview with Mr. John Ghanaian, who is chief of the local Mankato Indian Reservation. With some apprehension, Chief Naganagan related to me his memories of this evil subject. This article is based on what he related in that interview. The Bear Walker cult used the powers to settle grudges. The power of the Makwamosa is not used against whites. It is only for Indian against Indian. Chief Naganagan said that the practitioners were very sly indeed. In modern times, cult members would pose as good Christian churchgoers, but would be doing the devil's work on the side. The power imbued in modern practitioners comes down from ancient times as it has been passed from one generation to another. The manner of transfer is quite simple. When an Indian with the power feels that he or she nears death's door, they call to themselves kinsmen and simply tell that person, "I have something for you." The power cannot be refused, and the power must be used. By using the Bear Walker powers the possessor must kill at least one person per year, or the power will turn on its possessor and kill him or her. Among other things, the person with the power can transform themselves into any shape that they so desire. Most frequently, the choice is that of a bear. In this form, they stalk forth to revenge wrongdoings done to themselves or kinsmen, and they have a tremendous power indeed. If in this form they even pass by an innocent bystander, that person, unless extremely strong in constitution, is knocked unconscious by the sheer power concentrated in this being. Closely connected with the Bear Walker are bright lights. When a person transforms into the Bear Walk, they walk upright through the forest in search of its victims. The beast is ablaze with brilliant lights. At times, one of the more common shapes to be assumed is that of huge fireballs. The chief recalled one evening watching from the barn by his house. I remember one going down to the woods by my house. You could just see the trees all light up. There is protection, however, whether you be an innocent or the sought-after party. If you possess a little slyness yourself, when you have spotted the Bear Walker coming down the trail, you must double back. And when you double back, you must take a pinch of sand from the trail where it has walked, and place this in your lip. It is said that this kills the power of the beast. At the Mankato Reservation, there lived a woman practitioner. Her name need not be mentioned. At any rate, another elderly Indian has told me that he and his brothers were walking through the woods one day, and they saw a bear walker coming down the path. They got sly, as they would say, and hid off the side of the path. They leapt upon the beast as it passed. The beast was spitting fire and fighting like crazy, but it finally gave up. The monster turned into the woman mentioned above and begged for her release, which they granted. The legend of the bear walker is vague. Oftentimes, as it is being discussed, the story is contradictory. But then the Indians seem to be great storytellers. Still in all, it is believed in our area of Michigan by the Native Americans. One of the things that cannot be denied, and that is by their legends and stories handed down generation to generation, the Native Americans were indeed a superstitious people. Those here in my area were not and are not now an exception to that. That's boring.
The Howard Stern Show.
What happened? Give me a for instance. I want to know.
I'm turning red. I'm so embarrassed.
No, don't be embarrassed. Come on, share. Why not? We have to discuss these things.
Let's just say I was with somebody once and I saw a transformation that I can't explain.
The person transformed into something other than human.
Yes, I saw it.
Were you on drugs?
I was not. I was totally sober.
Wow.
You were talking with. I'm asking you some questions. If you were talking to someone, and you're having a conversation like we are now, this close, and the person suddenly, not in a hallucination, they said to you, "Look, something's going to happen here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to morph into something else," and you're like, "This is ridiculous."
That's not how it happened.
Give me a please. I want to see this.
Imagine you're doing something and suddenly you turn around and there's somebody else standing there.
A different human.
Sorta. It's hard to explain without going to detail. I'd rather not go into details.
Okay, but did you say to the person, "What'd you just do here?" That's
yes,
not you.
And they acknowledged it.
And what did they say they were? From another planet?
They wouldn't explain.
Why not?
Again, without telling the story, it's a really messed up story.
A famous person?
No.
Good. Why is he
Wait
not
a
famous?
minute.
By the way,
why is that good?
Believe it or not,
why didn't you put him on wrestling?
Believe it or not, they're actually a voting member of the Rock and Roll Academy.
Is that true?
No, I'm just.
It's Jan Wenner, isn't it?
But when you say they transformed into someone else or something
I mean, Billy,
else.
I've had that happen.
I'm being vague on purpose.
I was with a woman once. She took her makeup off. I didn't know who the fuck she was. I'm telling you, she totally tricked me. You talk about something like that, that's a different story. Wow. I mean,
it's up there with one of the most intense things I've ever been through.
Nick, you tie in black-eyed children in this. David Weatherling's work, it's pretty frightening. These strange kids that show up at your doorstep, and they want in.
Well, yeah, again, I mean, this is the case that I talk about in the book, again, is a very weird one. Now, I actually get a lot of black-eyed children reports, and I think primarily because there are a lot of deep similarities between the tales of the black-eyed children and of the men in black, in the sense that, the black-eyed children will turn up at people's homes late at night and try and find a way into the home, which, is very much like the sort of the angle that the men in black follow. And again, that like the men in black, the black-eyed children look pale and sickly, and they dress in black hoodies. So there are a lot of sort of overlaps between these two phenomena. But the case I talk about in the book, again, is an equally bizarre one, where a woman had this particular encounter late at night, classic scenario, just sitting watching TV, and suddenly there's a knock on the door, and very late at night, you think, well, who on earth's that? She went to the spot, looked through the spy hole at the front door, and saw these two children, the typical thing, the black hoodies. They were looking down at their feet, clearly in a way to try and prevent them from, for the girl from seeing their eyes. And so she put the chain on and opened the door. What do you want? We need to come in. Will you let us in? And that's one of the intriguing things, is that they always try and find a way to be invited in, which ties in with the old traditional stories of vampires. the idea that these creatures have to be invited into the home. They cannot just sort of cross the threshold, so to speak. But she talked about how, as she stared at these black-eyed children, that she got this deep sense of evil coming from them. And she felt, with hindsight at least, it was almost as if she'd blown their cover. And she said that for a second or two, they sort of shimmered almost like in a heat haze. And they went from looking like sort of, 11 or 12-year-old kids to literally morphing into the sort of classic reptilian type creatures that people talk about, these sort of 7 or 8 foot tall reptilian type humanoids, and then shimmered back again into the form of these black-eyed children. And not surprisingly, she slammed the door, and she actually told me she sort of just headed to the furthest part of the house and just sort of hunkered down on her hands and on the floor and just lay there, just sat there, just quivering, not knowing what to do. But she was plunged into a complete state of fear by seeing not just the black-eyed children, but seeing them kind of morphing into these, all I can call them is like bipedal lizards, and but it was interesting the fact that there was this sort of shimmering, as if, with hindsight, again, she wondered if they'd actually shape-shifted, or if the shape-shifting was actually the entities themselves manipulating her mind into seeing them in different forms to kind of amp up the fear and the anxiety.
I am by no means a religious person. I've never seen anything supernatural before. I do believe in aliens, other life outside of this planet. Even some of the myths that people seem to believe in, such as Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, even mermaids. But what I saw the other day was real and nobody believes me. Although if someone else told me this, I probably wouldn't believe it either. It was Friday, March 18th, 2016. I ordered some hiking boots and they just got here that day. The weather was nice surprisingly, since it rained so much in Washington, so I decided to go hiking. I went to Cadwell State Forest near Olympia. There was no one there, no traffic, no anything. It seemed kind of boring. I was just walking down this trail next to the road. But then a car comes driving by. It was comfortable and the top was down. I was crouched in the trail hiding so he wouldn't see me. The person stopped the car for some reason. He was a white man, short black hair and had on sunglasses. All of a sudden he changed. It was fast, like a blink of the eye. And then he was a red man, bald with small black horns on his head. He was wearing a black jacket. I only saw it from the waist up because it was in the vehicle. I was staring at this thing for a full minute trying to put this thing together. I thought, no, this can't be real. Thinking of other explanations, but there wasn't any explanation for this. What I saw was real. After this minute, it just drove off. I was scared shitless and just stood there for a couple minutes after that. I eventually went to the road where the car was and examined the area, but there was nothing. At first I thought I saw Sane, but I highly doubt that would be him. Then I thought it could have been a demon. But what makes the most sense to me would be a shapeshifter or an alien, or a shape-shifting alien. People think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. I wish I would have recorded it, but my phone was the last thing I was thinking about when I saw this creature. I have so many theories of what it could be. What if it is an alien from Mars? We're trying to turn Mars into Earth. So if there is life there, it would make sense for them to come to our planet and observe us, right? Or it could have just been an alien from another planet, or just a shapeshifter in general. I'm not 100% sure what it was, but I'm 100% sure that this thing that I saw that day, it was not human.
This time we have a story from Lincolnshire and it is called The Werewolf of Dogdyke. This is a story uncovered by Roger Parsons and is a fascinating account of Lincolnshire's very own werewolf legend. This is what Roger has to say about the story. I quote, "The story was recorded in 1926, and even today it sends a shiver down my spine. Reading this short tale, I wondered if other Lincolnshire places were said to have been home to such creatures. It was in an archaeological dig that the bones of the creature were found and a chapter of events set in motion. Without giving anything away, I would advise my archaeologist colleagues to avoid bringing unidentified bones into the house and leaving them on the kitchen table." The Werewolf of Dogdyke, dated 1815 to 1864. Legends of the Fenland People as told by Christopher Marlowe M.A., author of The Fen Country, 1926. Another extraordinary story of transformation was told by a young man who lived in Langrick Fen, not far from Dogdyke. He was an ardent archaeologist and one day while digging in the peat discovered some ancient remains. Among them was what looked like a human skeleton with a wolf's head. Carrying the object into his cottage he placed it on a table and examined it carefully. But he could make nothing of it and concluded that it must have been some monstrosity, such as showmen bring out at fairs to excite the interest of the crowd. That night, however, he found himself unable to sleep, and fancying he heard a noise in the back premises, got up to investigate. Suddenly he heard a sharp rat-tat on the window pane and looking round perceived a dark object looking at him. This speedily resolved itself into the form of a human being with a wolf's head. Every feature was distinctly marked and there was no possibility of reflection, since no light was visible anywhere. As the young man stood transfixed with horror, the creature gave a snarl of savage exultation and raised its arm to dash in the glass, whereupon he recovered the power of movement and fled into the kitchen. A crash sounded behind him and he wasted no time in locking and barring the door and erecting a barricade of furniture against it. There he waited all night in a cold sweat, while the stealthy pad-pad of feet sounded without. At last the first streaks of dawn told him that his long vigil was over and as the light grew stronger he ventured to unbar and open the door. Nothing was visible of the ghostly visitor, but the table, whereon he had placed the skeleton was overturned and the window of the room was shivered into fragments. Hastily collecting the remains of the uncanny being, which lay scattered all over the floor, he buried them again in the same place, where he had found them and covered them over with several layers of peat. Nor was he again disturbed, though for many years afterwards, he would describe with vivid gesture his peculiar adventure with the supernatural. Now we skip forward in time to 2016, and the story says, and I quote, "Earlier this month, a woman found the bodies of 2 mutilated hares in her garden and 2 very large paw prints on her window. Jackie Greenfield said she was freaked out after the finding at their remote home in Skellingthorpe. They then found the bodies of 2 hares on their lawn later that day. Jackie said, I have never seen a cat, dog, or fox anywhere even near our property. It's just very strange. We would go out at night and sit on the patio but since then I've been a bit wary. We look around and think, what is out there? This is not the only recent sighting. In December 2014, Adam Bird found a huge footprint in woods near Friskney. And he also snapped a mysterious dark creature lurking in the trees. He said, it looks like a shadowy figure stood within the trees staring at us from afar. It shows something dark, a different color against all that greenery. Roger Parsons, of the Lincolnshire Heritage Trust, said he believes the legend of the werewolf could be true. He said, the story of the werewolf of Dogdyke was recorded in 1926, and even today it sends shivers down my spine. The find seemed to awaken some creature and it set a series of strange events into motion, which some say are still happening in the area today." End quote. I will do some further digging on this story. I am pretty sure that I have seen quite a few reports of a werewolf-type creature in this area of the country, so stand by for other reports from us in the future. Thanks for listening. Until the next time then, goodbye for now.
But what's particularly intriguing is that, you speak to numerous people who don't know each other, have no axe to grind, no agenda, and yet they're all telling broadly the same story of how these things, at 1 second they were these large apes, the next second it was like this powerful, brilliantly lit form of energy, if you like.
Dogman. Tell me what Dogman is, first of all.
Well, the Dogman, George, is chiefly sort of the modern-day terminology for what centuries ago would have been known as a werewolf. Now, Linda Godfrey has done a tremendous amount of research into this area, demonstrating that a lot of reports of dogmen come from Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and typically people talk about seeing these large wolf-like animals that have the ability to walk on 4 limbs and 2 limbs, which obviously, on the 2 limbs gives them this sort of werewolf-type atmosphere, so to speak. And you can make a case that there are deep parallels between the Dogmen and the Skinwalkers of Native American lore. Very similar, these sort of strange, oversized wolves. But what's particularly intriguing about the Dogmen is that they have this ability to sort of not just stand on, go from 4 limbs to 2 limbs, but in some cases people have described the limbs of the animals morphing, almost as if, that they're physically changing to allow them to go from 4 feet to 2 feet, rather than just standing up, like a bear would, in a conventional way. It's almost as if the animals are supernaturally changing their bodies so they have this ability to walk on 2 limbs. What's interesting about the Dogmen reports is the locations where they're seen. Time and time again, they are like around some of the ancient mounds that you could find in places like Ohio and Wisconsin, built centuries ago. Also, we get reports in the UK where they've been seen around stone circles, ancient burial grounds, things like this. And so whatever these creatures are, they're clearly not just normal or abnormal, unknown animals. There's some sort of supernatural aspect to them as well. Now, of course, I understand when you start talking about dogmen and parallels with werewolves, this gets into highly controversial areas. But, when we talk about werewolves today, most people think of the classic Hollywood imagery of somebody bursting out of their clothes on a full moon. It's not like that when you read the real reports. Certainly that's the way they look, but the shape-shifting revolves more around the limbs. It doesn't revolve, around about a person literally morphing into, an animal. So I find that kind of intriguing, and the fact that, as I said, there are certain locations which time and again crop up. And again, one of the other parallels that we had with the Native American Skinwalkers and the Men in Black, and which we also get with the Dogmen, is that when people get too close to them, they feel nauseous, they feel sick, and in some cases they literally fall sick. Again, suggesting there's some sort of negative energy at work. Whether it's designed to keep us away or whether it's not even done deliberately, but there's something going on where people don't react in a good physical way to being in close proximity to these things. That what happens is that the person literally does get ill, and I've got a number of cases in the book where this has happened, and the person has had to have a significant amount of treatment to cure what is sometimes like a really bizarre and extremely rare, type of illness or disease. I've got several cases where people had seen dogmen and they went down with like staph infections, and which had to be treated, which got quite serious in one case. So when you put all those cases together, it takes on a very sort of disturbing kind of vibe.
You've touched all the bases in this book, Shapeshifters. You even touch on black helicopters.
Well, yeah, I mean, most people are probably thinking, if you're going to talk about shapeshifters, you're going to be talking about living creatures, of course. And for the most part, that is what the book covers. But I thought it would be sort of cool to sort of look at, another angle of shapeshifting. Now, most people, if not everybody listening to the show right now, I'm sure has heard of the black helicopter phenomenon, which very often turn up in UFO sightings, and in relation to cattle mutilations particularly as well, where a rancher hears this helicopter over his property late at night, looks out the window, sees this black helicopter with no markings. Next day, goes out into the field and one of his cows is laying there, with organs removed, etc., etc. And that is sort of, the kind of scenarios that we have these black helicopter sightings in. But what's particularly weird is that in some cases, these helicopters don't appear to be what we would call normal helicopters. Now, there are some reports of these helicopters flying completely silently. And I'm not talking about, just technology to camouflage the sound to a significant degree. I mean, literally totally silent. And the people have come across these helicopters and been perhaps within 20 or 30 feet of them, and there's absolutely no sound. Now, which again suggests, very odd components. But there are a number of other cases, several of which I've got, which came from alien abductees, who said that they saw these black helicopters, and as they were looking at them, interestingly enough, like with some of the other cases where the black helicopter kind of shimmered as if it was in a heat haze, and then took on the form of what we would call like a classic flying saucer, which has given rise to the idea that these things, if, in one sense shapeshift, or in another sense, they have the ability to camouflage themselves. So the theory is that, you could be seeing a black helicopter, but in reality, it could be something else. It's almost like a supernatural kind of stealth technology to alter the form, or at least perhaps even manipulate our perceptions of how we see these things. And of course, this opens the door to even more controversial questions. Are these black helicopters that are seen in UFO incidents and cattle mutilation events, are they actually real black helicopters of a government agency, or are they some sort of projected, camouflaged image to have us believe that that's what it is, rather than have us see the phenomenon for what it really might be, which would be, something far more connected to the UFO phenomenon itself.
What's your gut tell you, Nick?
Well, I think there's two things going on here, George. I think there are some legitimate cases where, military agencies have sent out black helicopters to investigate, paranormal phenomena, cattle mutilations, etc. But I have a huge number of reports of these sort of morphing helicopters. I've easily got 30 or 40 reports. And when you have that many reports, it's very difficult to dismiss this aspect of the phenomenon. Now, of course, a lot of researchers do dismiss it because it's too weird. But for me, there isn't much that is too weird. And I think when you get that many reports from different people, you have to accept that this is a part of the phenomenon. And so I do think there is some validity to the idea that in a number of these black helicopter cases, what we're seeing is actually not a black helicopter at all, but is presenting itself in that way. Whether the shape-shifting technology is a camouflage or a stealth-type technology or something more supernatural, I don't know. But the angle of these helicopters having the ability to appear in different ways, there's no doubt in my mind that that's happening in some cases.
And Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster, fits into some of these.
Yeah, it does. The phenomenon of the Loch Ness Monster didn't really begin until the early 1930s, and that was when a large new road was built near the loch, which allowed people to drive past it. That's when the sightings began. In other words, it wasn't just a new phenomenon out of the blue. Up until 1933, it was very difficult to negotiate Loch Ness because there just weren't any good roads at all in the area. And so when the roads were expanded, people started to report seeing these creatures more and more. But what's interesting is that although the traditional image that people have of the Loch Ness Monster, sort of this humpbacked, long-necked type creature that sort of superficially resembles a prehistoric plesiosaur, that isn't the only form that people have described these creatures as looking like. Now, what's interesting is if you go back into ancient Scottish folklore of the 15 and 1600s, so we're talking 300-400 years ago, 500 years ago even, we find that there were traditions in many Scottish lakes, and loch is just a Scottish term for lake, reports of what were known as kelpies. And kelpies were shape-shifting creatures that could take on multiple forms, like a large black horse and a beautiful woman. And according to the old legends, they would stand on the edge of the lakes and try and entice wary passers-by to come towards the water's edge. And then supposedly they would, seize the person and steal their soul and take it deep below the loch. That's the traditional folklore. But these tales of these so-called kelpies have their modern-day equivalents with the Loch Ness Monster. As I said, how the long neck, the humpback, that's the traditional image we have. But we also have reports where people have described the Loch Ness monsters as looking like giant frogs. Other people have described them as looking kind of like a salamander. You have other reports where one woman described the creatures having tusks, another one said it looked like a crocodile. Now, in most of these cases, the witnesses were close enough to get a fairly accurate view and interpretation of what they were seeing, and yet we have multiple different descriptions of what most people would assume is just one kind of animal. And when you look back and tie it in with the old stories of the kelpies, which were shapeshifters, you can make a good case that the Nessies of today and the kelpies of the distant past are one and the same thing, and that today's monsters are the very same shapeshifters that existed all those centuries ago.
That's amazing, the kind of work. How difficult was it for you to find all these stories?
Well, I mean, it's usually sort of like a two-pronged approach, George. One would be where I like to do a lot of in-depth research, but I guess, the more books I write, the more books I write or articles or radio shows, the more feedback I get. So, I've been very lucky and fortunate in the sense that, people are willing to share their stories and, giving permission for them to be used. So, without the witnesses who, I always point out the witnesses are the most important people, because without them, we don't have anything to go on. So, when you get these stories given to you, that does make the job easier in terms of being able to then launch a deeper investigation. But yeah, these stories, the Loch Ness stories are fascinating in terms of the way in which we can make these parallels in the 21st century with what was being seen 400, 500, 600 years ago. And all that's really changed is the name. Today they're known as the Nessies. Back then they were the kelpies. And this issue of shape-shifting monsters in Scottish lochs doesn't just revolve around Loch Ness.
All right, let's talk more about these creatures, shapeshifters, when we come back on Coast to Coast AM.
I have a lot of creepy things that happened in the backwoods. Probably the most inexplicable and downright scary was the time I encountered what I believe was an old Appalachian witch. About a month ago, I hiked to a place called Dismal Creek in Transylvania County, North Carolina, known as the Land of Waterfalls. The county is just running wild with creeks and tributaries. Very beautiful. But it's always had a very mysterious feel. I've always felt curious when visiting the area. Dismal Creek was different though. A man by the name of Jim Bob Tinsley wrote a book called The Land of Waterfalls about southwestern North Carolina and described Dismal Creek as the most foreboding place in the southern Appalachians. Keep in mind, I only learnt this after my visit, and had I known of Tinsley's apprehension, I would have likely never visited. The hike itself is ridiculously demanding. Grades of over 50% make up the majority of the hike, and that's not an exaggeration. There are 4 waterfalls on the way up to the creek. The first 2 very sublime, safe, but there's something channeling through. About the time you hit the third, called Grotto, the feeling of dread starts to become very prominent, but a sense of beckoning drew me onwards. A very difficult feeling to describe. I got to a split in the path, and because the area is so unforgiving, my map was inconclusive. I could hear the falls down the mountainside, but I felt I needed to go up and over via the right path. I left a certain car in for myself to determine the way back, and headed up the ragged jumble of earth that was the ridgeline. I had just started the intense scramble when I got the sense that I was being watched. I turned around and looked behind me, and thought I saw someone disappear into the rhododendron and mountain laurel surrounding the trail. I only saw the back of what appeared to be a cloak. There was no sound. It didn't make sense. The leaf litter gives away even the smallest insect. I should have heard something. I attributed this to the combo of dehydration and sheer exhaustion. I've seen shadow people in the woods before due to that, so I really didn't put too much stock into it. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread though. I continued the climb, step after grueling step, and after cresting over the ridge, I was in the dismal hollow. I found myself looking down a nearly 70-degree angle with a rope anchored to a tree. I semi-rappelled down to a second rope and finally the bottom. Then came a wet rock scramble to the base of the falls. The falls were breathtaking. A 200 feet gentle cascade within a 40-foot sheer drop at the top. Incredible. I sat down to chew on some mountain mint, and that's when I glanced at the top of the falls. I nearly fell off the edge of the log in the creek. There was a woman up there. She was pretty far away, but appeared to be wearing an old cloak of sorts. Grey, tightly curled hair. That's all I could see from my vantage. She was facing me for a few seconds, before turning and walking off out of view. I immediately got up and started scrambling up the mossy soaked rock cascading towards the top of the falls. I got there after a very treacherous scramble, only to find nothing. Hands on my knees and taking laboured breaths, I heard a voice from the bottom of the hall. "Hey!" It said it in a strange and spectral voice. It sounded hollow. I turned to look, and there she was, disappearing into the rhododendron once again. I was in total and absolute disbelief. I felt sick to my stomach. I carefully picked my way down to the base again and started the trail out. I just felt like I shouldn't be there, like I'd seen something I shouldn't have. I'm a long-time bushman. I'm not afraid to say I'm as tough as nails, but I wanted to run out of there crying. I finally made it to the top using the ropes for help. As soon as I rested the ridge, my nose started bleeding. Only a few drops. I kept moving and was essentially running due to the mountain slide. I got to the bottom and followed the path indicated by the Karen. I kept running and came to a blind curve, and I nearly ran into her at full speed. In trying to stop, I took a tumble, and when I opened my eyes she was standing over me. She looked very Scottish, the curly hair and fair skin. She didn't look particularly gruesome or hag-like. She was very old, but it was obvious that in her youth she had been very beautiful. Her eyes though, the eyes were very alive and full of vitality, very youthful, and the irises were so light blue they were almost white. Though her form appeared benign, I had the distinct feeling that she did not mean me well, and that she did not want me there. I wanted to crawl away from her when I had fallen, but I was blocked up against a rock. I edged along until I regained my feet and backed away from her. Her expressionless gaze never left me. I ran until I was well off that mountain. When I stopped running, I was on a more well-established trail. When I had come into the area, I felt fine, but now I could feel the dread still. All was silent as I hiked out, not a single animal sound. I was almost out when suddenly a bobcat appeared on the trail ahead of me, seemingly from nowhere. I stopped and looked at it as it looked at me. It had her eyes. I knew they were her eyes. I told her I wouldn't be back and told her the mountain was beautiful. Then I left as she disappeared into the rhododendron thicket